Welcome back to Witness Titanic. Thank you for joining me for this episode 6. This week, we will continue questioning Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller, the highest-ranking surviving officer. Last week, we learned a whole lot about an officer's life aboard ships in this era. We learned that the Titanic's officers were aware of the iceberg telegrams, as Lightoller would call them, and that they were not in the proximity of the ice in those telegrams, but they were heading straight towards it. And although Lightoller heard a jar, or felt a jar, and heard a grinding sound, he did not believe that anything serious had taken place. On today's episode, we continue our look at this testimony and see Lightoller as he slowly realizes how serious this incident truly is. So, without further ado, let's jump right back into it. Lightoller is asked how long after the collision they started uncovering the lifeboats, and he says about 20 minutes, which puts us at midnight. The other officers more or less back this timing up. So between the collision and Lightoller's immediate reaction and uncovering the boats, Lightoller doesn't really give much information. He apparently just sat in his quarters. Another officer will give us a bit more information about that time period, so hang tight for that. So it's midnight, and the lifeboats must be uncovered. How does one uncover a lifeboat aboard Titanic? Lightoller explains. Now, the following explanation is taken from a bunch of answers throughout his testimony, and they're not given in this order at all. So I've rearranged them to be, as if he was giving a step-by-step description of what needs to be done. So again, this comes from all over the place, but this is essentially how he describes it. He says, "We have to take the covers all off, haul out all the falls, and coil them down clear. Then heave it out over the side, then lower it down level with the rail. As soon as the boats were lowered to the level of the rail, I would detail one man to jump in and ship the rudder, one man to cast adrift the oars, and one man would see that the plugs were in, and then commence to fill it with people." And to just give you a little bit more of a clearer image of what he's talking about there, every lifeboat has a rudder, a tiller on the back to help steer, but they aren't. They have to be put in place. So they're stowed inside the boat, and so one man has to ship the rudder, as he says. And then they have to get the oars out and whatnot. They're also inside the boat. And then one man would see that the plugs were in. These lifeboats have holes in the bottom of them, so they will drain if they are ever filled with water. And from what I understand, the lifeboats are stowed without the plugs in place, maybe in case, I don't know, rainwater gets in? I don't know. But it just seems like somebody has to put the plugs in before it gets in the water, and that does become a problem later this evening. Lightoller is asked how soon after the boats were cleared, or, swung out, I suppose, did they get the order to load them with women and children. He answers, "I dare say about 10 minutes or quarter of an hour." Lightoller's estimate, mixed with some testimony elsewhere, puts the loading of women and children commencing at about 12:25, 45 minutes after the collision. So now we have swung out the boats, we've prepared them for lowering, and we're even loading the boats. But how were these boats loaded, and by whom? Lightoller provides some info. "I was on the port side, and Mr. Murdoch was on the starboard side, and the chief officer was superintending generally and lowered one or two boats." He also says, "I am under the impression that the chief officer put out a couple of the after ones on my deck, as well as supervising. He evidently found that he had the time, and put out a couple of these boats, and he also lowered the emergency boats, so I think it is 3 he put out of the 10 on that side. That left me 7. I think that is about what I put out, 7. Now, Lightoller is about to make a series of decisions that will follow him for the rest of his life, unfortunately. One of the more cruel and dumbfounding aspects of the sinking is that the male passengers had different odds of survival depending on which side of the ship they decided to stand on. Officer Murdoch on the starboard side of the ship had a somewhat relaxed interpretation of the women and children order, letting quite a few men into the boats if there were available seats and no women were around to take them, which they weren't very often around to take them. Think back to episode 3. Bruce Ismay is allowed into Lifeboat C, lowered by Murdoch on the starboard side because apparently there were no women around to take the seat. Lightoller on the port side, however, was extremely strict, and aside from the very few crewmen that he let in to man the boat and row and whatnot, he only allowed women and children to board. But even then, he clarifies, excepting the stewardesses, we turned several of those away. He turned away the stewardesses. The female crew members were turned away. That is how strict this man was about letting anybody on board aside from women and children passengers. So women and children passengers only in lifeboats that very few feel safe to board in the first place is a recipe for, disaster. But surely he filled these lifeboats with as many women and children as he could find. Well, if you have made it to episode 6 of this podcast, I think you already know the answer to that. The Titanic disaster is known for many tragic reasons, but one of the most talked about are her half-filled lifeboats. You've all heard the stories. Titanic only carried enough boats for half of those on board, and even the boats they did have weren't used to their fullest potential. Why was this? Well, primarily, 4 men were in charge of loading these boats. Captain Smith helped load a few, but did not survive to explain his reasoning. Chief Officer Wilde helped load a few, as Lightoller just told us, and he did not survive to explain his reasoning. First Officer Murdoch loaded every boat on the starboard side and did not survive. So Lightoller, who says he loaded 7 boats, he's our most official take on this process. So what can we learn about these criminally underused lifeboats from a man who loaded them? In the first boat, I put about 20 or 25... 20, sir. How many men? No men. How many seamen? 2. In the first boat? Yes, sir. Was that sufficient to take care of the boat? We wanted them up on deck. Then later he's asked, how many did the second boat contain? About 30. How many men? 2. So Lightoller's first 2 boats have, by his estimation, between 20 and 30 on board when launched. That's 20 and 30 each. Now, we know through a bit of research and other testimony, spoiler alert for future episodes, that these 2 boats were Lifeboat 6 and 8. There is quite a debate over which one left the ship first. Many witnesses can't seem to come to an agreement, and Lightoller's own recollection seems a little bit confusing. But we know that they were 8 and 6, or 6 and 8. We also know these boats will arrive at Carpathia with an estimated 23 to 25 on board each, so those numbers line up. Each of these lifeboats is designed to carry, at capacity, 65 people each. Lightoller launches 2 boats with a total of about 80 empty seats. Outrageous. Why on earth would he do this? What a terrible officer he must be. Well, he gives us 3 very good reasons. First, why only 2 crewmen to each boat? We were not undertaking a boat drill then, sir. We were saving life, and we were using the men to the best of my knowledge and ability. How many men? As a rule, I put about 2 seamen in a boat. There is no use in sending too many men away and then finding yourself short. This is frankly very smart. Keep in mind how many men Lightoller described needing just to prep a boat. 1 for the rudder, 1 for the oars, and 1 for the plugs. And let's definitely not forget, these boats are being lowered by hand. The davits, those crane arms that swing the boats out, those are just a system of pulleys. There's no motor lowering these boats. There's no mechanical part of it or electrical part of it. 2 men grab a rope each, and hand over hand, they lower the rope, and their side of the boat then lowers. And they have to remain in sync, or else all the passengers get dropped out of the boat 7 stories into the sea. This is a terribly serious business, lowering these boats. It has to be done very, very carefully. If he sends too many of his crew into these boats, he won't have enough to launch the rest. And yes, there are hundreds of crewmen on board, but what he's talking about running out of are the seamen on board, the deck department crew members, the able-bodied seamen, the quartermasters, the lookouts. These are men who are trained to row a boat, or are supposed to be trained to row a boat. Apparently, some of them turn out to not know how to do it. But these are men who can man a boat properly. Lightoller isn't going to turn and grab a steward, like a bedroom steward, and put him in a lifeboat unless he absolutely needs to. And it is something he does turn to when he runs out of his deck department. So that's why these boats are manned by only 2 men. But why stop loading at 20 to 30 women and children? Why not fill the boats to their capacity of 65? Let's ask. How did you reach a conclusion as to the number that should be permitted to go in?
My own judgment about the strength of the tackle. It all depends on your gears, sir. If it were an old ship, you would barely dare to put 25 in.
Students of the Titanic disaster, write this down. Lightoller is touching on a topic that to this day does not get talked about enough. The documentaries will never touch on this because it's not as dramatic as just telling you that the lifeboats were half filled and it was a useless waste of life. What he is touching on is that these lifeboats, yes, they have a capacity of 65 once they're in the water, and provided that the water is a flat calm, like it is on the night of Titanic sinking. But they also have a lowering capacity, and it is not 65. He answers in more detail on a later day of his testimony. How much difference do you make between the safe capacity of the lifeboat in the water and up at the boat deck hanging in the davits?
Well, with a brand new ship and all brand new gear, brand new boats, and everything in the pink of condition, a boat might be safely lowered. You cannot guarantee it. She might go down safely with perhaps 20 to 25 in her.
So according to Lightoller and Titanic's other officers, they back him up. Could 65 people fit in this boat? Yes, apparently very uncomfortably. In fact, many survivors were astounded to hear that there was room for more in their boat when they got to Carpathia. But while 65 could technically fit, it certainly didn't look like it. And that aside, that is 65 people in calm water, not freely hanging over the side of a sinking ship and lowered into the ocean by 2 men holding rope. To this day, we spend so much of our time talking about these half-filled lifeboats. What a dramatic story that is. But talk to the crew of Titanic, and they are very clear, very, very clear throughout the inquiries, that the capacity we talk about only applies once the boat has safely reached the water. When this lifeboat is dangling over the side of a ship and being lowered by hand, that capacity is much, much smaller. But luckily, even Lightoller sees the problem in this limitation.
By the time I came to the 3rd boat, I was aware that it was getting serious, and then I started to take chances.
How many passengers did the 3rd boat contain?
I can only guess. I filled her up as full as I could and lowered her as full as I dared.
How many seamen?
2.
Now, we can't be fully sure what boat he is talking about here. It could be boat 12, it could be boat 14. They were both launched around the same time, and again, Lightoller's memory of the order seems to be a bit wonky. But both boats seem to have been launched with about 40 people in them, based on what we know about them. And that's a great improvement. It's not 65, but it's not 25, so Lightoller is making progress. He is asked about his next boat. As for the 4th boat, you followed the same course?
The same order, the same conditions.
You put 2 men in each?
I think I was getting short of men, if I remember rightly. I started to putting 1 seaman and a steward in.
And this 4th lifeboat brings us to one of the most often repeated Titanic stories, and unfortunately for researchers, one of the more frustrating parts of Lightoller's U.S. testimony. He describes an event that is well known to us today involving a first-class passenger, Major Arthur Peuchen. Now, we know Arthur ended up in Lifeboat 6. We know that for a fact. But we also know that Lifeboat 6 was likely the first or second boat that Lightoller launched, but he's remembering this as the 4th boat. So is it the 4th boat? You know, this is where Titanic people, we get headaches looking at all the different conflicting witness testimony. But regardless, the following story, wherever it takes place in the night of the sinking, the following story takes place at Lifeboat 6.
Yes, that was the boat I had to put a man passenger in. I could only find one seaman. I had started to lower the boat. I had put 2 seamen in, and then I wanted 2 for lowering. It is absolutely necessary to have a seaman on each fall. No one else can lower a boat. I was calling for seamen, and one of the seamen jumped out of the boat and started to lowering away. The boat was halfway down when the women called out and said there was only one man in the boat. I only had 2 seamen, and I could not part with them, and was in rather a fix to know what to do when a passenger called out. He merely said, "I will go if you like." I said, "Are you a seaman?" And he said, "I am a yachtsman." I said, "If you are sailor enough to get out on that fall, that is a difficult thing to do. Over the ship's side, 8 feet away, and means a long swing on a dark night. If you are sailor enough to get out there, you can go down." And he proved he was by going down, and he afterwards proved himself a brave man too.
Folks, imagine this. Major Peuchen, a man just days away from his 53rd birthday, which in 1912, that's a lot older than it would be today, leaps off the ship, just fully runs and jumps off the ship and grabs hold of a rope in midair like Indiana Jones and lowers himself down multiple stories. That is some true bravery and true strength right there. Titanic's legacy is covered in these brave stories, but usually these stories only exist because they've been passed down through generations and overblown by documentaries and whatnot. This moment, there's really no way around it. This is a brave, brave thing to do. But I want to point out something about this story that often gets completely overlooked. And it's another kind of bravery. And it gets overlooked mostly because Arthur Peuchen does this action movie level thing. But note that Lightoller says he has 2 crewmen in the boat, and when it came time to lower, he called out for another man to help lower. And one of the men manning boat 6 gets back on board the sinking ship and helps lower the boat. That is an incredible thing that gets forgotten. So props to this crew member who pulled a Rose Dawson and hopped back on a sinking ship to do his job. So let's take stock here. Lightoller has launched 4 lifeboats. Regardless of what number each was, this puts us between about 1:30 and 1:45. We have less than an hour before the ship will disappear forever. And Lightoller has 3 more boats he will concern himself with, Boat 4 and collapsibles D and B. Lightoller will now tell us a painful saga of Lifeboat 4, which is undoubtedly the 5th boat that he launched before turning to the collapsibles forward.
We had lowered a boat from A deck, 1 deck below. That was through my fault. It was the first boat I had lowered. I was intending to put the passengers in from A deck. On lowering it down, I found the windows were closed, so I sent someone down to open the windows and carried on with the other boats, but decided it was not worthwhile lowering them down, that I could manage just as well from the boat deck. When I came forward from the other boats, I loaded that boat from A deck by getting the women out through the windows.
So this is another popular story in Titanic books. The very first boat that Lightoller ever lowered on this evening was actually Lifeboat 4. He only lowered it down to A deck, thinking he could load women and children through the windows. He thought it was a good idea because there was a rope running along the ship on A deck for coaling purposes, and he thought they could tie the boat to that rope, and then that would make it a safer boarding experience for the passengers. But when they got down there, they realized that the windows were closed, but they couldn't just open them. There was a key that they needed to open the window. So the key had to be found. It was a whole thing. The passengers that would end up in Lifeboat 4 spent the night getting lowered down to A deck, back to the boat deck, down to A deck. It was all very inconvenient, I'm sure. But they finally boarded their boat through the windows around 1:50 a.m. with just 30 minutes left in the sinking. So the very first boat that Lightoller technically lowered became one of the last boats that actually reached the water. This boat would actually have a few notable passengers and stories from the loading process, but Lightoller seems unaware of any of it, so we will wait to interview witnesses from this boat to hear what the experience was truly like. We should probably check in with Lightoller on how he's doing with lifeboat capacity this late in the sinking. He started with 20 to 30 per boat. He seemed to move on to 40-ish per boat. With these final 3 boats, he is asked, "You were still using your best judgment?"
I was not using very much judgment then. I was filling them up. I knew it was a question of the utmost speed to get the boats away.
In that situation, you were quite sure that they were filled to their capacity?
Yes, sir. I don't say their floating capacity. I don't say 65.
But about the same number of persons were in each boat.
I should say 35 or 40.
So Lightoller seems to have maxed out at 40 per lifeboat, but hey, it's better than 25. Before we get to Lightoller's last 2 boats, we have to hop across the ship to collapsible boat C and our old friend Bruce Ismay. It's about this time that he is boarding lifeboat C, forever changing his life. Well, even though Lightoller did not witness this event, he did not witness Bruce getting into Lifeboat C, he does have a bit to say about it on his second day of testimony. He heard the following story from a reliable source.
Chief Officer Wilde was at the starboard collapsible boat in which Mr. Ismay went away, and that he told Mr. Ismay, "There are no more women on board the ship." Wilde was a pretty big, powerful chap, and he was a man that would not argue very long. Mr. Ismay was right there. Naturally, he was there, close to the boat, because he was working at the boats, and he had been working at the collapsible boat, and that is why he was there. And Mr. Wilde, who was near him, simply bundled him into the boat.
How interesting that Lights forgot to mention this story on the first day of his testimony, and he also apparently forgot this reliable source that told him this story. This just seems extremely transparent. This is clearly a White Star Line officer trying to clear the name of Bruce Ismay. It's not a great look for Bruce. I stand by what I said about Bruce in the in the second and third episodes, but stories like this really hurt his case. But as I always say, there's usually a bit of truth on both sides. That the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think that this story is made up, but I don't think he needed to make it up. I don't. I feel like the only way that this is truly damning is if it's to cover up Bruce pushing a woman out of the way to take a seat, which is something that we know didn't happen. I just wish Bruce would have just stuck to what actually happened. Unfortunately, in 1912, nobody was going to give him a pass on anything, but we can try. Moving on. So Lightoller has 2 boats left. The last boat is Collapsible B, which he won't actually launch per se. It'll just float away. So we are left with Collapsible Lifeboat D. It is the last boat that he will successfully launch. Take it away, Lightoller.
In the case of the last boat I got out, I had the utmost difficulty in finding women. I called for women and could not get hold of any. Somebody said, "There are no women." It took longer to fill that boat than it did any other boat, notwithstanding that the others had more in them. On 2 occasions, the men thought there were no more women and commenced to get in, and then found 1 or 2 more, then got out again.
He is asked for more details about this. Were there any women left on deck?
On the port side, on deck, I can say, as far as my own observations went, from my own endeavor and that of others to obtain women, there were none.
Now, officer, how do you account for the fact that there were no people? Where were the other people who were not in the boats?
That I have been unable to fathom. I've tried to find out for my own edification, but I cannot fix it up.
So just like Collapsible C across the ship, Collapsible D struggles to find enough women to get in the boat. Unlike Murdoch, however, Lightoller will not allow any men in, and so the boat is lowered. With how many on board? Lightoller says,
between 15 and 20.
Now, before we lose our minds at this, please remember that the collapsibles don't have a water capacity of 65. Theirs is 47. So they are smaller boats. They're made of canvas, and according to Lightoller, they won't hold very many. So to launch with 20 is not as egregious, but it's still not great. It is now roughly 2:05 a.m., with 6 boats successfully launched and just 15 minutes left in the life of Titanic. Lightoller turns his attention to the collapsible boat stowed on the roof of the officers' quarters. He also tries to lend a hand with Murdoch doing the same task on the other side of the ship with collapsible A. At this point, things should be getting pretty hectic. However, I will point out that Lightoller is asked if he witnessed any panic during this portion of the sinking. And like most survivors who answer this question, most survivors who were still on the ship at this point, he says,
"Not in the slightest."
At any time?
At no time.
He's also asked, the men all refrained from asserting their strength and crowding back the women and children? Lightoller answers,
"They could not have stood quieter if they had been in church."
This is one of those wild things about Titanic, and again, he's not the only one who reports this. It's impressive how calm 1912 society seemed to stay throughout the most famous sinking in history. Now, this is aided by the fact that 1912 society also didn't think that anything was wrong until way late in the sinking, sure. But for 2,200 human beings to not immediately turn into animals, which is, I think, what would happen if this was 2024, it's very impressive. If you'd like more evidence to support this lack of panic, Lightoller tells another story about it, this featuring an appearance by a group of men, all of whom will probably not be seen again after this moment.
Shortly before the vessel sank, I met a purser, Mr. McElroy, Mr. Barker, Dr. O'Loughlin, and Dr. Simpson, and the 4 assistants. They were just coming from the direction of the bridge. They were evidently just keeping out of everybody's way. They were keeping away from the crowd so as not to interfere with the loading of the boats. McElroy, if I remember, was walking around with his hands in his pockets. The purser's assistant was coming behind with the ship's bag, showing that all detail work had been attended to. They were perfectly quiet. They came up to me and just shook hands and said, "Goodbye, old man."
A fascinating and tragic moment that is happening all over Titanic at this moment. Men turning to each other, shaking hands, and saying goodbye. You'll see it time and time again. Sometimes you can assume it's a bit fabricated to show men being super heroic and strong and not afraid and being all British and whatnot. But it happens so much that you have to assume a few of these did go down this way. Now, in future episodes, we will hear from third-class passengers and others who may be able to shed more light on the infamous trapped like rats legend of Titanic. Third class being held back by gates. It's in every movie of Titanic. So did it happen? Did it not happen? We will touch on that with third-class passengers who experienced the life of a third-class passenger trying to survive. But Lightoller does briefly touch on this, and you can sort of take this or leave this kind of thing. He is asked, had the passengers the right to go on the deck from below?
Every right.
There was no restraint at the staircase?
None.
Was that true as to the steerage?
The steerage have no right up there, sir.
Did they on that occasion?
Oh, yes.
There was no restraint?
Oh, absolutely none.
I almost feel like, does Lightoller slip up there a little bit? I don't know. I may be reading into things too much, which is what happens if you spend too much time with other people's words in text form. We've all experienced that. If you've ever gotten a text that you feel is super cryptic and you read it 100 times in a million different voices. But he does sort of say, the steerage have no right up there, sir. And then Smith says, did they on that occasion? And he says, oh, yes. I don't know. It's just interesting. So Lightoller, at least, he's our first person, our first official on this podcast to say that third-class passengers were not held back in any way. We'll see what other people have to say about that. We now reach Titanic's final moments. Lightoller has been trying to get the final 2 boats off the roof of the officers' quarters. It has become clear that they will not manage to do this in time, and the boats will have to float off the ship, as will Lightoller. He is one of the few survivors of this disaster who ended up in the water, and he will not let the U.S. Senate forget this as they look for possible scapegoats for the disaster. In one of Lightoller's best moments, he is asked, what time did you leave the ship?
I didn't leave it.
Did the ship leave you?
Yes, sir.
Iconic. Stone-cold response out of Charles Lightoller. With his point made, he is asked for more detail. How much of the ship had gone down when you left it?
I went underwater on top of the officer's quarters, immediately at the forward part of the forward funnel. So she was underwater at the fore part of the forward funnel.
He is asked further, when you left the ship, did you see any women or children on board?
None whatever.
And he is asked further, were the lifeboats gone when you found yourself without any footing?
All except one.
So with the water reaching the forward funnel and almost the collapsible boats, Lightoller loses his footing and ends up in the drink. What was that like? Can you tell us how cold the water was?
I should say it was not much over freezing. How much, I could not say. It might be 33 or 34.
That's 33 or 34 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way, or about 0 degrees Celsius. And this is, of course, a guess on Lightoller's part. It was actually more like 28 degrees or -2 Celsius. Folks, I ask you if you have ever been in water this cold. The answer is likely no. You may have visited a spa and gotten into a plunge pool with ice cold water, or if you're an athlete, you may have done like a recovery session in cold water therapy. These pools that I'm talking about, they're usually kept at about 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 7 to 10 degrees Celsius. That's like the coldest I think that we are allowed to make things for like a consumer, like in a spa. I don't think they can be colder than this. And that's about 20 degrees warmer in Fahrenheit than what Lightoller is experiencing right now. In his book, Lightoller wrote a book all about Titanic, which we will definitely dive into in a later episode, much later. We'll give Lightoller a break after this. Lightoller does provide a now infamous quote about what it felt like to get into the water. He doesn't say it in his inquiry, so I'll say it here. He says,
"Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body."
Fans of the 1997 film Titanic will recognize that line. So Lightoller is now in this freezing cold water, but it is about to get way worse for him.
As I say, I was on top of the officer's quarters. There was nothing more to be done. The ship took a dive, and I turned face forward and also took a dive. I was driven back against a blower, which is a large thing, which faces forward to the wind and which then goes down to the stokehole. But there is a grating there, and it was against this grating that I was sucked by the water and held there. And then this explosion, or whatever it was, took place. Certainly, I think it was the boilers exploded. There was a terrific blast of air and water, and I was blown out clear. Barely threw me away at all, because I went down again against these fiddly gratings, immediately abreast the funnel over the stokehole.
So not only does Lightoller jump into the ocean, feel the pain of 1,000 knives all over his body, but he gets sucked into a grating, which is just a big air vent, basically. And then he gets blown away by a burst of air from below, and then gets sucked against another grating. And the ship is sinking. He is literally being pulled down with Titanic, almost like Titanic doesn't want him to leave. And Lightoller is not the only one to experience this. First-class passenger Archibald Gracie will one day have to regale us with his heroic tale of experiencing the exact same thing. So Lightoller finally frees himself of the ship's attempts to take him down with her, and he emerges directly next to collapsible Lifeboat B. So it looks like Lightoller's luck has shifted. But not so fast. Collapsible B has managed to flip itself upside down. Not great. He takes it from here.
Immediately after finding that overturned lifeboat, and when I came up alongside of it, there were quite a lot of us in the water around it, preparatory to getting up on it.
With life preservers?
Yes, sir. Then the forward funnel fell down.
Were there any persons there without life preservers?
No, sir. Not that I know of. The forward funnel falling down, it fell alongside of the lifeboat, about 4 inches clear of it. It fell on all the people there were alongside of the boat, if there were any there.
Sort of an interesting back and forth there. Lightoller is trying to describe one of the most dramatic moments in the final minutes of Titanic sinking, the forward funnel falling and potentially landing on top of people. And the senator just wants to know about the life preservers for some reason. But anyway, we are now minutes away from Titanic disappearing forever. Clearly, by this point, panic must have set in amongst those left behind, and Lightoller is asked, did they make any demonstration?
None.
Was there any lamentation?
No, sir. Not a sign of it.
So, according to Lightoller, there is no panic aboard the ship in her final moments. Other witnesses may have something to say to that, and I look forward to sharing their stories with you in future episodes. But from the second officer's perspective, everyone remained positively British, as they would say. Now Lightoller is asked an important question. By this point in the investigation, it has become known that some witnesses saw Titanic break in two. Now, in 2024, we know that she did break in two because she lies in two parts on the ocean floor. But in 1912, it was up for debate. And as I said in a previous episode, the amount of people who would claim that it broke in two greatly outnumber the number who say that she sank intact. But the general public would really love to hear from Officer Lightoller, an experienced seafarer, the highest-ranking surviving officer of the crew. Surely he can settle this debate once and for all. Let's ask him. Was the vessel broken in two in any manner or intact?
Absolutely intact.
This answer will greatly contribute to decades of arguments. The Titanic community arguing, can you believe it? Moving on. And so Titanic is gone. It is 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, and we are aboard the underside of collapsible Boat B. Lightoller is asked who was on board this upside-down lifeboat with him, and he names
Mr. Thayer, a first-class passenger, the second Marconi operator, I can tell you his name in a minute, Bride, Colonel Gracie. I think there were 3 or 4 who died during the night.
Aboard this boat with you?
Yes, sir. I think the senior Marconi operator was on the boat and died. The Marconi junior operator told me that the senior was on this boat and died.
He is speaking, of course, of Titanic hero John Phillips, who sent virtually every Titanic distress call on the night of the sinking. He stayed at the quay to the very end and boarded the underside of Lifeboat B along with Harold Bride, but unfortunately, John Phillips did not survive the journey to Carpathia. Many others would fall from collapsible B throughout the night as well. In fact, we will inevitably hear much more tragic stories about Lifeboat B from other witnesses, but Lightoller has taken charge of this almost makeshift lifeboat and is determined to guide them to safety. It is said that Lightoller had to organize the men in such a way that they could lean left and right to keep the boat steady as the waves began to pick up throughout the morning. We should be very clear that this upside-down collapsible boat would be 100% ineffective in normal ocean waves. The only reason these men survived this evening was because of the very same flat, calm waters that doomed Titanic in the first place. Luckily for these roughly 28 men, at some point in the evening, other lifeboats come to their rescue, and Lightoller ends up in charge of Lifeboat 12, which is, for the first time in this testimony, at full capacity. Lightoller explains.
I counted 65 heads, not including myself or any that were in the bottom of the boat. I roughly estimate about 75 in the boat.
Was the boat safe with that number of people in it?
Safe in smooth water only.
And that is not an exaggeration. Lifeboat 12 will arrive at Carpathia with around 70 survivors in it, which again, in normal North Atlantic conditions, this boat would have absolutely gone under quite quickly. Lifeboat 12 will actually be the last boat to reach Carpathia, partially because, as Lightoller describes, he wasn't even navigating the ship toward the rescue vessel at all.
We held our bow onto the wind. The boat was too full. In fact, she was dangerously full, and it was all I could do to nurse the boat up to the sea.
So he's just trying to keep the boat facing the wind, which is how you battle the elements at sea. And as we know from other survivors, the flat calm that Lightoller and Captain Smith spoke about just 12 hours earlier is giving way to rougher seas. So as the morning progresses and the sun comes up the night or the morning after the sinking, there's sort of a race against the clock. These boats need to get to Carpathia because it's about to get a bit dicey. Luckily, they reach Carpathia, and Charles Herbert Lightoller is the last survivor of the Titanic disaster to board the rescue vessel. But before Lightoller wraps up his testimony here, I have 4 more quotes for you that I find very fascinating. First, Lightoller tries once again to speak on behalf of his boss, J. Bruce Ismay. Remember how Bruce was intent on holding the Cedric in New York so he and the crew could return home immediately? Well, clearly he got criticized for this because everything Bruce did looked suspicious. It looked like he was trying to run away from the U.S. inquiry. Bruce's main defense was that he didn't know the U.S. would have an inquiry, but Lightoller comes in here and not only takes the blame for the whole Cedric situation, but also presents another defense, though this one is far more legitimate.
On having a conversation with Mr. Ismay, he also mentioned about the Cedric and asked me my opinion about it, and I frankly stated that it was the best thing in the world to do if we could catch the Cedric. We discussed the pros and cons and deemed it advisable to keep the crew together as much as we could. Otherwise, you understand, once the men get in New York, naturally, these men are not going to hang around New York or hang around anywhere else. They want to get to sea to earn money to keep their wives and families, and they would ship off. We would have lost a number of them, probably some very important witnesses.
Lightoller's defense of Ismay continues in this next quote. I want to say that this is genuine because, as you know, I feel for Ismay, but sometimes I think Lightoller pushes too hard to protect him, and that it just comes across as a bit over the top. But I'll let you be the judge.
I may say that at that time, Mr. Ismay did not seem to me to be in a mental condition to finally decide anything. I tried my utmost to rouse Mr. Ismay, for he was obsessed with the idea and kept repeating that he ought to have gone down with the ship because he found that women had gone down. I told him there was no such reason. I told him a very great deal. I tried to get that idea out of his head, but he was taken with it. And I know the doctor tried too, but we had difficulty in arousing Mr. Ismay purely owing to that wholly and solely that women had gone down in the boat and he had not. You can call the doctor of the Carpathia and he will verify that statement.
I always say the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. I think Ismay could have had this reaction aboard Carpathia, but I also think Lightoller was asked to defend Ismay, and so he draws on an experience that they actually had, but it just comes across as too much. Lastly, Lightoller is asked for his overall view on the disaster as a whole. His first answer here is classic inquiry Lightoller. Taking the experience that you passed through in your judgment as a navigator, what improvements could be made in the maritime laws or in the rules and regulations governing the operation of a ship?
I could not answer that without serious consideration. I have not been able to give the matter sufficient thought to justly answer that question here. There is no doubt we might make some improvements, which shipbuilders are trying to do all the time, and the White Star, as far as I know them, in particular. We have instructions, particularly to the commander and officers. As far as our side of it is concerned, the officers on deck, every suggestion we have to offer is met with every consideration and is deeply considered, as I have proof by the captain, and anything that tends toward the improvement of the ship or members of the ship is immediately carried out.
What a long non-answer. Lights is clearly a company man in this situation. Basically, that whole paragraph, all he said was, I need to think about it. Surely there's something we could improve, but the White Star Line's improving all the time. They listen to our suggestions if we have them. Like that's all he said there. But Lightoller is in a really tough situation here. To be the suddenly the highest ranking surviving officer, and Bruce Ismay, the real representative of the White Star Line, isn't being listened to. Like he can't be trusted in the court of public opinion. So Lightoller really needs to stand strong for his company. And he does a great job, but it's clear he's jumping through hoops right now. And for our final quote, I give you his best answer from the entire inquiry. It is clear throughout his testimony that he attempts to poke a little fun at the Americans. If he can highlight a stupid question, he does. He's clearly defending White Star Line, but also annoyed that he, like Ismay, can't go home due to this inquiry that no one expected to take place in the first place. So this is the perfect example of Lightoller throwing a little shade, as we say these days. This comes from earlier in his testimony when he's describing the iceberg collision and the damage that follows. He is asked, I will get you to state, not only from your actual knowledge of the immediate effect, but also from your experiences as a navigator and seaman, what the effect of that collision was on the ship, beginning with the first effect, the immediate effect, how it listed the ship, if it did, what effect it had then, and what, in your opinion, was the effect on the ship that resulted from that collision. Lightoller answers,
The result was she sank.
And with that, the witness withdrew. Well, folks, we have hit over 100 highlights from Lightoller's testimony over these last 2 episodes. He will be questioned in even more detail in the UK inquiry, and I look forward to sharing that with you as well. However, we will now take a short break from 1912 witnesses and speak to another modern witness of the Titanic disaster. Next week, we will be speaking to someone who witnesses Titanic every day, Thomasina Ray, the director of the RMST Artifact Collection. I've actually already recorded the interview, so I can already tell you with confidence that you won't want to miss it. Folks, we are 6 episodes in. I hope you are having a nice time. I know I am. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a huge favor and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or rate the podcast on Spotify, or subscribe, wherever you're listening. Whatever you can do, it would help me out a lot as I try to grow this podcast. The larger the audience is, the more likely I'll just keep doing this. And I'd really love to do this for a very long time, because this is kind of my favorite way to dive into Titanic stuff. So until next time, I am your chairman, James Penca. Be nice to each other, Titanic community. I'll see you next week when we will continue our fascinating investigation into the loss of Titanic.